Boy, isn't this nice? Coming into a nice warm greenhouse on a chilly winter day. Now, I don't happen to have a greenhouse, but if I did, the first thing I'd build would be a gardener's workbench with an area to store pots, someplace for all the gardening tools, and a nice big work surface that'll take a lot of abuse and moisture. And underneath, I'd find an area to store all my various potting soils. I guess I'll take a few measurements, get up to the drafting board, see what I can come up with. When it came time to choose the material for our gardener's workbench, the choices were obvious: redwood for the frame and MDO for the working surfaces. Now, MDO board is just plywood-based material with a paper surface. It's very resistant to water, and it's very durable. Now, I make no pretense to be a gardener, but I do have access to some of the best gardeners in the country. And it was their combined knowledge and suggestions that allowed us to come up with this design. Now, they asked for a few specific things. 3 shelves at the back, and they said make them fairly wide, so I used 1x10s. And they said don't make it much higher than 6 feet because you won't be able to reach anything when you're standing in front of the bench. Now, the back is open, and that's not a problem because they said it would go against the wall of a greenhouse or a garage. But they did want it to be rigid, so I put this X-brace in. Now, the working surface is the MDO board, and they requested that it have a backsplash and sides, so the material wouldn't spill out. They also wanted an area to store things such as markers, scissors, and some garden tools. So I built this little storage compartment. It's only about 10 inches deep. Another thing they wanted was a place to store potting materials, and they left that up to me. So I came up with these bins. They pivot out, and they hold about 2 cubic feet of material. And the idea is you just scoop it out and put it up on top of the table. Now, I'd also like to take a moment to talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injuries. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now, to get started on today's project, I want to work with some 2x4s to make the front leg, the back leg and back shelf standard, which is all one piece, and the front shelf standard. Now, they require dados for the shelves and dados for the side rail that supports the work surface and the side rail that ties the legs together. Now, to cut the dados, I really have 3 tools that I can choose from. One would be the router and a straight edge. One would be the table saw, and the other is the radial arm saw. I think the radial arm saw is the best choice. The router and straight edge, they take a long time. You've got to set it up at each place that you want to cut a dado. The table saw works quite well, but the real disadvantage is that your layout lines have to be facing down, and it's real difficult to make sure you're staying true and straight. The radial arm works the best because the layout lines will be up, and you're just pulling the saw through the material. Now, to cut the dados, I'm going to use what is known as a stacked dado head cutter, and it has several components. First, a blade that goes on. Now, I want to get a 3/4 inch dado for those shelves, so the blade gives me the first eighth. Then I'm going to put on what's known as chippers, a series of chippers. Each one equals an eighth. So now we have 1/4, 3/8, 1/2 inch, and you notice that I'm staggering them, I'm spacing them out, 5/8, and finally one more blade, which will give me a 3/4 inch width. I'll put the nut on the shaft, put the guard back on, plug it in, and I'm ready to go. What I'm starting to do now is cut a dado in the front legs into which this 2x4 for the cross piece will fit. It actually supports the bins. Now, the depth of the dado is about 1 inch and 5/8, and that exceeds the capability of my dado head cutter. So I'm just going to use my saw blade and the table saw. I'm using a process called nibbling, where you run the piece through the saw, a little bit at a time, just moving it over, nibbling away the material. Now you push it through and move it over so it'll clear the blade as you bring it back. I never want to cut on the back stroke. Using the same nibbling technique, I need to make a little rabbet in the ends of this 2x4 that supports the bins so that it'll fit over the 1x6 side rail. Well, I'm almost ready for some assembly, but before I get started, I want to do something to the bottom of the legs. This is the front leg, and this is the back leg that goes up into the standard. And I've learned from experience that if you don't do something with these sharp corners, that as you slide the bottom of the leg on the floor, it's going to chip and break off. So to prevent that from happening, I'm just going to use an ordinary block plane. I'm just going to chamfer the edges all the way around. Well, now we're ready for some assembly. I'm going to make each side frame. The joints will be assembled using construction adhesive and galvanized bugle head screws. Now, I have no problem getting this workbench out of the workshop or where I'm going to bring it. But if you don't have a 34-inch wide door opening, you might want to hold off on the adhesive. Now this piece of 2x4 is the front standard that supports the front edge of the shelves. It gets fastened the same way. With the side assembly clamped on edge at the workbench, I can now start installing the 1x10 shelves. More construction adhesive, more screws. Now this piece of 2x4 is centered on the rails at the bottom of the bench. It goes from side to side, right in the middle. And it adds some stability to the base, but more importantly, it's where the back of the bins will rest when they're closed. The back of the workbench is reinforced with a simple X brace. It's half-lapped in the middle, and it's fastened to the shelves and to the frame. I found the best way to lay it out was to actually take my pieces of 1x3, put a center mark on the end of a 6-foot piece and align it with the corner at the top. And then down at the bottom, I would align the center mark with the mark that's 9.5 inches up from the bottom of the leg. Now all I have to do to lay out the half lap is mark this face of this one and the underside of the other piece for the dados. And for the corners, I'll just take my pencil and run it along the side of the frame. Cut off the corners with my saw, make the half lap with my dado head. you might have noticed that I've been pre-drilling every place I put screws in. Now, even though redwood is a very soft material and the screws would go through easily, it also splits very easily, so it's important to pre-drill. Here's a piece of 3/4 inch MDO that's about 36 inches across and 48 inches tall. And out of that single piece, I'll be able to get my backsplash, the work surface area, the bottom of the tool tray, and the back of the tool tray. And I'll rip it on my table saw. This piece of MDO board for the backsplash needs a little notch at the bottom of each corner to fit over the side rail. I'll make that notch at the table saw. For the little end cut, I'll just do that freehand. Now, one place that I decided not to use any construction adhesive was on this backsplash and later on the work surface. And that's because if there's anything you might have to replace on this workbench, say maybe 20 years from now, it would be those two pieces. This 5.5 inch piece of 3/4 inch MDO is the back of the tool area, and it also provides some support for the work surface. Okay, now that takes care of the cleat that'll support the back edge of the work surface. Now here at this piece of MDO board, I'm going to put some little cleats to support the bottom of the tool shelf. I'm going to fasten it in place with some construction adhesive and some 1.25" finish nails. Okay, now for the tool shelf. And I think actually this will be the last thing that I'll put in today. We'll finish up tomorrow. I want to get started today by installing the work surface. I want to run a bead of the construction adhesive right along the back edge here. And that's to seal up the plywood, prevent it from getting moisture in the edge. Okay, we'll just squeeze that in. I'm just going to put 4 screws down each edge. Now to attach the backsplash to the counter area, I'm putting 4 screws in through the back. The less screws in the counter surface, the less the chance for deterioration. Now to seal up the front edges of the plywood and to dress it up a bit, I'm going to install these 1 1/4 inch redwood strips. And they're held in place with construction adhesive and nails. The next thing that I want to make are these side pieces, and they're slightly tapered, about 1.5 inches over 22 inches. And I'm going to do that over at my table saw with the little accessory that I bought at my hardware store, a tapering jig. It's made out of metal channel, has a pivoting point on one end, a little dial in degrees and inches per foot, which is pretty handy. It has this swing arm, which is used to adjust it to varying tapers, and a little stop here that you rest the material against. Used in combination with my rip fence, you can cut a pretty wide range of tapers. I've already done the adjustments for the taper I want, and I'm ready to run my stock through. The joiner does a nice job smoothing up the saw cut. Okay, now it's time to turn our attention to the bins. The sides of the bins have a little curve, and that's necessary so that they can open. If they were square, they wouldn't be able to tip. Now to lay out that curve, all I need to do is use my tape measure and a pencil. I'll just put the tape measure at about 22 inches on one corner, hold my pencil at the tip of it, and just scribe an arc. And now to cut it, I'm just going to use my portable jigsaw. Okay, that is one matched pair. Now I'll just make another one. Okay, to smooth up the saw cuts from the jigsaw, I'm just using my small belt sander. You might have noticed that I've clamped all 4 side pieces together. And that's because the wider the base is for the sander, the easier it is to keep everything nice and square. Let me remove one of these bins so I can show you the construction details. The front of the bin is 3/4 inch MDO. The sides and the back are 1/2 inch MDO. And the bottom is another piece of 3/4 inch MDO. Now the bottom sits in rabbets in all 4 side pieces. And I've set up at the table saw to do that. I've also made a rabbet along the edge of the front panels, and that's for the side to sit into. I just finished running a 1/2 inch wide dado along the back edge of all the side pieces, and that's for the back of the bin to fit into. I've just run the pieces for the back through my table saw with the blade tilted a little less than 45 degrees. And that's necessary so that the top edge will conform to the shape of the side. Now we're ready to put the bins together. Now I'm going to assemble the bins using some construction adhesive and some 1 1/4 inch galvanized finish nails. here at the upper front corners of the bin, I've added a couple screws because this is the point that's most likely to have the greatest amount of stress as you open the bin. The operating mechanism for the bin to pivot on couldn't be simpler. Just a 3-inch butt hinge. Half of it gets fastened to the front rail, and half of it gets fastened to the bottom of the bin. There's really no need to mortise them in. To attach them, I just hold the hinge in position, and using my drill with this device, I pilot a screw hole. Now the device has a little tip that fits into the countersink of the hinge, and when you push on it, the drill bit comes out and drills a pilot hole. The last thing to get installed is this little cleat. It actually acts as a stop for the bin, so it won't just fall out onto the floor. Pretty simple device. When you start to open the bin, it hits the front leg and holds it in the open position. Is there a gardener around who wouldn't like a workbench like this? Well, I know one in my family who's going to be real happy when she sees this. 3 shelves at the back, and they said make them fairly wide, so I used 1x10s. And they said don't make it much higher than 6 feet because you won't be able to reach anything when you're standing in front of the bench. Now the back is open, and that's not a problem because they said it would go against the wall of a greenhouse or a garage. But they did want it to be rigid, so I put this X-brace in. Boy, isn't this nice? Coming into a nice warm greenhouse on a chilly winter day. Now, I don't happen to have a greenhouse, but if I did, the first thing I'd build would be a gardener's workbench, with an area to store pots, someplace for all the... Now, the working surface is the MDO board, and they requested that it have a backsplash and sides, so the material won't spill out. They also wanted an area to store things such as markers, scissors, and some garden tools. So I built this little storage compartment. It's only about 10 inches deep. Another thing they wanted was a place to store potting material, wood for the frame, and MDO for the working surfaces. Now, MDO board is just plywood-based material with a paper surface. It's very resistant to water, and it's very durable. Now, I make no pretense to be a gardener, but I do have access to some of the best gardeners in the country, and it was their combined knowledge and suggestions that allowed us to come up with this design. Now, they asked for a few specific things: the gardening tools and a nice big work surface that'll take a lot of abuse and moisture. And underneath, I'd find an area to store all my various potting soils. I guess I'll take a few measurements, get up to the drafting board, see what I can come up with. When it came time to choose the material for our gardener's workbench, the choices were obvious. Redwood